Eleanor Harding stood on the creaky wooden porch of her family home, the morning sun casting long shadows across the worn brick pathway. Her eyes settled on the wrought iron gate, ornate, twisted with delicate scrolls and faded black paint, that had guarded the entrance for more than a century. It wasn't just a gate. It was a silent sentinel to 5 generations of Hardings, a monument to love, loss, and resilience. But today, it felt different. Taped to the gate's iron bars was a stark white envelope bearing the crisp emblem of the Meadowbrook Homeowners Association. Eleanor's heart tightened. She slipped the envelope free, her fingers trembling slightly as she unfolded the letter inside. Notice of violation. Removal of non-compliant structures required. The words blurred as her breath caught in her throat. The HOA demanded the immediate removal of the gate, citing aesthetic non-compliance with community guidelines. 10 days, no exceptions. Failure to comply would result in escalating fines and potential legal action. Eleanor's mind raced. How could they do this? The gate was part of her family's legacy. Her great-grandfather had hand-forged those iron bars in the town's old foundry. Her grandmother had painstakingly restored it after the Great Flood of '49. This was history, a physical thread woven through her family's story and the neighborhood's past. The HOA board had never said a word, no warnings, no discussions, just this cold, impersonal letter. Eleanor's eyes swept the quiet street. The familiar clapboard houses stood neatly in a row, their manicured lawns shining like a postcard. But beneath that postcard-perfect facade lurked something far less innocent. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a message from Clara, the neighborhood's unofficial gossip. Heard the HOA's making moves. Your gate's just the start. Be careful. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the phone. What did that mean? She hadn't spoken to Clara in weeks. Her gaze flicked to the driveway, where a black SUV sat idling too long for a visitor. Eleanor's heart skipped as a tall man stepped out, dressed in a dark suit and sunglasses despite the early hour. Good. Morning, Mrs. Harding, he said, flashing a badge Eleanor hadn't seen before. I'm with the Meadowbrook HOA Compliance Division. We're here to inspect your property. Eleanor swallowed hard. I wasn't expecting anyone, and you're here to ensure that the community guidelines are followed, he said smoothly, stepping forward. Specifically, the removal of that gate. She felt her jaw tighten. This gate is protected by historical preservation laws. I won't remove it. He glanced at his clipboard, unconcerned. The HOA has overriding authority on aesthetic standards. You will comply or face fines. Eleanor's fists clenched. At her sides. This was war. As the man circled the gate, snapping photos, Eleanor's neighbor, Mrs. Craven, peered cautiously from behind her curtains. Eleanor caught her eye. Something flickered there, a mixture of fear and something else. Resentment? Indifference? Back inside, Eleanor paced the faded floral carpet of her living room. The house seemed to groan, as if mourning its own threatened fate. Her fingers traced the antique family portrait on the wall, a stern-faced great-grandfather who'd built this home from the ground up. She could almost hear his voice whispering through the years, "Protect what is ours." The letter's deadline loomed like a storm cloud. 10 days to either surrender her heritage or fight a faceless authority determined to erase it. Eleanor's phone buzzed again. This time an email from the HOA board. Failure to comply will result in penalties up to $500 daily. Legal action pending. She swallowed her fear and typed a reply. This gate will not be removed. A cold wind rattled the windows as the sun dipped low, casting eerie shadows that stretched like fingers across the room. Eleanor's fight had just begun. The legacy of 120 years was under siege, and the enemy was closer than she ever imagined. The following morning, Eleanor awoke to an uneasy quiet settling over Meadowbrook. The bird song was muted, the neighborhood streets strangely empty. As she poured her coffee, she glanced out the window and spotted the black SUV parked again, this time farther down the block, its engine humming softly like a lurking predator. She shivered and pulled the curtains closed. Whatever the HOA was planning, it was no longer just about the gate. Later that day, Eleanor decided to confront the HOA board directly. She strode to the community center, a nondescript brick building, where the board held their meetings. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale coffee and cheap carpet. The board members sat stiffly behind a long table, their faces unreadable masks. At the center sat Richard Carmichael, the HOA president, a man whose carefully manicured hair and icy stare spoke volumes about his appetite for control. "Mrs. Harding," he greeted her with a forced smile. "We're here to maintain Meadowbrook's property values and community standards. Your gate, while charming, is an eyesore by today's measures." Eleanor's voice was steady, but inside she burned with defiance. "My gate is a piece of history. You don't get to erase it with a letter and a threat." Richard's smile tightened. "This isn't personal. It's policy." But Eleanor had noticed the cold glances exchanged behind her back, the barely concealed impatience. This wasn't just about policy. It was personal. Something darker simmered beneath the surface. On her way home, Eleanor noticed that several neighbors were unusually quiet or turned away when she passed. Her longtime friend Tom avoided her gaze, and whispers ceased abruptly as she approached. That night, as Eleanor sat reading on the porch, her yard lights suddenly flickered out. The gentle hum of electricity was replaced by an eerie silence. She blinked, then caught movement in the shadows near the driveway. A figure, cloaked in darkness, crouched low, camera in hand, clicking rapidly. Eleanor's breath caught. She stepped forward cautiously. "Who are you?" The figure froze, then bolted, melting into the night before she could get a clear look. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Who was spying on her? Was the HOA orchestrating this intimidation? The next morning, Eleanor found a note slipped under her door. It was unsigned. "Let it go, Eleanor. You're fighting a losing battle." The message chilled her more than the night's encounter. At the grocery store, she overheard neighbors whispering, "She's stirring trouble," and "the HOA is just doing what's best." Was she becoming a pariah? Eleanor realized the HOA's influence was deeper than she imagined. They had turned friends into strangers, peace into suspicion. Determined, she began documenting everything, the letters, the strange visits, the flickering lights. She photographed the gate in every detail and called a local historian for advice. The historian, an elderly man named Mr. Whitaker, listened carefully. "Your family home is one of the oldest in Meadowbrook," he said gravely. "There are laws protecting properties like yours, but the HOA seems determined to ignore them." Eleanor felt a spark of hope. If the law was on her side, maybe she could fight back. But even as she plotted her next move, the sense of being watched grew stronger. Her mailbox was rifled through, her tires slashed one night, and a faint smell of smoke drifted from her yard. Someone wanted her to give up. Yet Eleanor stood firm. Her home was more than a house. It was her ancestors' story, their sacrifices, etched into every beam and brick. She would not let that legacy be bulldozed under a tide of faceless bureaucracy. The silent war had begun. Eleanor's nights grew restless. Every creak of the old house echoed louder. Every shadow seemed to move with purpose. The house, usually her sanctuary, now felt like a trap surrounded by invisible enemies. One evening, just as the sun dipped, below the horizon, Eleanor noticed movement outside her living room window. A slender figure, cloaked in a dark hoodie, slipped between the hedges, holding something that gleamed faintly. A camera. Her heart hammered. Without thinking, she grabbed her flashlight and slipped quietly out the back door. The figure froze when, The beam caught their face, a young man's eyes wide with surprise. "What are you doing here?" Eleanor demanded, voice low but firm. The man swallowed nervously. I'm just taking pictures for a community project, I swear." Eleanor narrowed her eyes. "Since when did taking pictures at night require sneaking around like a thief?" Before he could answer, a car's headlights swept across the yard. The man bolted, disappearing into the night like a ghost. Eleanor stood frozen, the flashlight trembling in her hand. Was he really innocent? Or was he part of something bigger? The next morning, she found her mailbox emptied of letters, her personal, files gone. Someone was cleaning up after themselves, or warning her to stop digging. Determined, Eleanor dove into the town's archives, spending long hours beneath the dusty glare of fluorescent lights. What she found was unsettling. Several HOA meeting minutes were missing, pages torn or smudged beyond recognition. The official records of community decisions that affected her home, were incomplete at best, doctored at worst. She printed copies of the remaining documents and shared them with Mr. Whitaker, the historian. His face darkened as he studied the pages. "This is no accident," he said quietly. "Someone doesn't want the truth about Meadowbrook to come out." What truth? Eleanor's mind raced as she pieced together clues. The HOA's sudden push for conformity, the silence from the historical society, the strange behavior of neighbors. Everything hinted at a shadow running deeper than she could see. Back at home, Eleanor's paranoia deepened. The flickering lights returned, accompanied by faint tapping noises on her windows late at night. She caught glimpses of figures lurking just beyond the garden fence, vanishing before she could get a closer look. One evening, she found a discarded flyer pinned to her gate, scrawled in angry red ink. "Heritage or Hell, Meadowbrook's Dark, Secret." No signature, no explanation. Eleanor's phone buzzed with an anonymous text. "Stop digging, or next time it won't be just your gate." The threat chilled her blood, but the fire inside her grew brighter. She wasn't just defending. Iron and wood, she was standing against something corrupt, something that had clawed its way into the heart of her beloved neighborhood. Late that night, Eleanor sat by the window, watching the street. A shadowy figure moved stealthily between houses, pausing at her gate before slipping away. Who was watching her? What did they want? The questions multiplied, but Eleanor refused to be silent. The legacy of 120 years was more than a gate. It was a battle scar in a war she never expected to fight. And the shadows were closing in. Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, her laptop screen glowing with the letter she had just drafted to the local historical society. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard as doubts crept in. Would they support her? Or had the HOA's influence already spread too deep? Minutes later, the reply came, polite but cold. "Thank you for your inquiry. At this time, the Historical Society must remain neutral on ongoing community disputes." Neutral? Eleanor felt the sting of betrayal. It was clear the HOA's grip extended even to those sworn to protect the past. But Eleanor was not one to back down. She enlisted the help of a young lawyer she'd met through a neighborhood fundraiser. Marcus Chen. Sharp, determined, and unafraid to take on the powerful, Marcus promised to help her navigate the treacherous legal waters ahead. Together, they filed a formal appeal to halt the HOA's demand, citing state heritage protection laws. But the response was swift and merciless. The HOA escalated the matter, filing a lawsuit demanding immediate removal of the gate and payment of all outstanding fines, now totaling thousands of dollars. The court summons arrived like a thunderclap, turning Eleanor's world upside down. Suddenly, the battle was no longer between neighbors. It was a full-scale legal war. Worse still, Eleanor began hearing rumors. Whispers that the HOA board was secretly negotiating with a real estate developer eager to demolish the neighborhood's historic homes for a new housing project. The implications were staggering. If true, the fight for her gate was a proxy battle for the soul of Meadowbrook. Eleanor confronted Richard Carmichael at the next HOA meeting, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and anger. "Are you selling our history? Our homes? What is this really about?" Richard's icy smile froze. "Mrs. Harding, Meadowbrook must evolve. We can't live in the past forever." Her neighbors' faces betrayed their own doubts and fears. Some averted their eyes, others whispered among themselves. The community that had once seemed so close now felt like a powder keg, ready to ignite. Late that night, Eleanor found her mailbox empty again. More chillingly, her tires were slashed. A note was left, scribbled hastily. "Back off or lose everything." Fear surged through her veins, but so did resolve. Marcus helped her file a police report, though officers warned that evidence against anonymous threats was hard to pursue. Still, the incident added urgency to their fight. Eleanor also uncovered irregularities in the HOA's rule enforcement. Several neighbors had ignored the same guidelines without penalty, while she alone faced relentless fines and threats. Marcus suspected selective enforcement, possibly a tactic to force her out. As they prepared their legal defense, Eleanor began gathering allies, neighbors who felt uneasy about the HOA's heavy hand but feared retaliation. She hosted a discreet meeting in her home where a handful of residents shared stories of intimidation and unexplained fees. "We're stronger than they think," Eleanor said, her voice steady. "If we stand together, we can protect our homes and our history." But the sense of danger only grew. Late one evening, a window shattered in her living room. No one was seen leaving. Eleanor locked the broken window, her mind racing. Someone wanted her to quit. Someone was willing to cross lines. Yet Eleanor knew the fight was no longer just hers. It was for every family who called Meadowbrook home, for every story buried in these weathered walls. And as the legal battle tightened, its grip, so did the web of secrets, lies, and threats that surrounded her. The war for the gate was just beginning. The next morning, Eleanor's phone buzzed with a message from an unexpected number. The text was brief but urgent. "Meet me at the old library after dark. I have information about the HOA." Curious and cautious, Eleanor agreed. As twilight settled, she made her way to the weathered stone building at the edge of Meadowbrook. The library had long been abandoned, its windows boarded and its halls silent, except for whispers of forgotten stories. Inside, Eleanor found a man waiting. His gray hair was thin, and his eyes held the sharp clarity of a retired judge, someone who had seen battles of law and morality countless times before. "I'm Judge Collins," he introduced himself quietly. "I've been watching your fight. The HOA's actions aren't just aggressive, they may be illegal." Eleanor's breath caught. "Why are you helping me?" Collins smiled faintly. "Because sometimes history needs a protector. And you reminded me of my own mother, who fought a similar battle decades ago." Soon after, Eleanor met Marcus Chen, her lawyer, who brought more than legal expertise. He was a rising star in civil rights law, unafraid to challenge corrupt institutions. Together, the trio began to unravel the HOA's carefully constructed facade. Judge Collins had uncovered irregularities in how the HOA board had been elected. Several members appeared to have falsified residency documents. Marcus found evidence that certain fines were levied without proper hearings or notification. Even more alarming, Eleanor learned that the HOA had failed to file mandatory disclosures related to their dealings with the suspected real estate developers. As they pooled evidence, Eleanor's once isolated battle grew into a community movement. More neighbors approached, quietly relieved to find allies in her and Marcus, but the HOA's retaliation intensified. One evening, Marcus arrived at Eleanor's home, grim-faced. They've started a smear campaign, anonymous flyers accusing you of violating community trust, even vandalism to your property. They want to break you. Eleanor nodded, resolute. They'll have to try harder. Her allies devised a plan to expose the HOA's corruption publicly. They gathered testimonials from neighbors who had been threatened or intimidated, assembled records of the HOA's rule violations, and prepared to present it all in court. But, even as hope blossomed, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching her every move. Strange cars appeared outside her house at odd hours. Once, a low drone hummed overhead, disappearing when she reached for her phone. Her home became a fortress, cameras installed, windows secured. Yet the shadows persisted. Then came the breaking point. At a packed community meeting, Eleanor stood before the crowd. She laid out the evidence, the forged documents, the missing meeting minutes, the selective enforcement of rules. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room. Richard Carmichael tried to speak, but voices drowned him out. Enough! Eleanor's voice rang clear. This isn't just about my gate. It's about who controls Meadowbrook's future. Are we a community that honors its past, or one that sells it to the highest bidder? The crowd erupted in applause. The board members exchanged worried glances. For the first time, the HOA was on the defensive, but the fight was far from over. Later that night, Eleanor received an anonymous package, a folder thick with more evidence, photos, documents, recordings. It was from the man in the hoodie, the spy in the shadows. A note accompanied it. Use this wisely. You're not alone. Eleanor's heart pounded with a mixture of relief and fear. Allies had appeared from the darkness, but so had deeper dangers. The war for her legacy had entered a new, more perilous phase. The day of the trial dawned gray and heavy, as if the sky itself anticipated the battle unfolding inside the courtroom. Eleanor arrived early, clutching the thick folder of evidence, the anonymous package, that had breathed new life into her fight. Inside the packed courtroom, tension crackled like static. Reporters jostled for seats, neighbors whispered nervously, and across the room, Richard Carmichael sat rigid, his usual calm replaced by a sharp edge of unease. Marcus Chen stood beside Eleanor, his jaw set, ready to dismantle the HOA's facade. Piece by piece, the judge called the session to order. The HOA's attorney, a slick man named Whitmore, wasted no time. He painted Eleanor as a troublemaker, a woman clinging to outdated relics at the expense of community progress. Eleanor's heart pounded, but she held steady, letting Marcus take the lead. The defense's first blow was the revelation of forged residency documents within the HOA board, evidence pulled from the anonymous folder. The courtroom murmured. Whispers of fraud echoed in the hushed room. Judge Collins's quiet presence in the gallery lent Eleanor strength. His decades of experience seemed to weigh on every word Marcus spoke. Witnesses took the stand. Neighbors, who'd faced intimidation, those who'd received fines without explanation, even an HOA employee who admitted to covering up complaints. Eleanor's own testimony was heartfelt. She spoke of the gate's history, her family's sacrifices, and the emotional toll of the relentless attacks. Outside the courtroom, a growing crowd of supporters held signs. Protect Meadowbrook's heritage and justice for Eleanor. But the HOA fought back fiercely, calling experts to argue that the gate was unsafe, that historical protections did not apply, and that community standards must prevail. At one tense moment, a whispered threat from an unknown source was overheard in the courtroom hallway, causing a ripple of unease as the trial unfolded. It became clear this was more than a dispute over a gate. It was a struggle between grassroots community and hidden power. Days passed with mounting pressure. Eleanor's home, though protected now by cameras and neighbors' vigilance, remained a target. Strange noises, suspicious vehicles, even a break-in attempt left her shaken. Marcus uncovered a secret deal. The HOA had quietly sold rights to the developer, plans that would demolish not just Eleanor's home, but dozens of historic houses. Eleanor's fight was now a fight for her entire neighborhood. At a crucial moment, the judge allowed Eleanor's team to introduce the anonymous evidence despite the HOA's objections. The balance began to shift on key. The final day, as closing arguments echoed, Eleanor felt the weight of history and future pressing down on her. Her legacy and the soul of Meadowbrook hung in the balance. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, the air thick with anticipation. Today was the day Eleanor had dreaded and prepared for, the climax of the trial. Every breath felt heavier, every second stretching taut like a wire about to snap. Marcus rose for his closing argument, his voice steady but charged with conviction. "Your Honor," he began, "this case is not merely about an iron gate. It is about the rights of homeowners to protect their heritage, their history, and their homes from clandestine deals and corrupt power." He gestured toward the opposing counsel. "The HOA board has repeatedly ignored the law, manipulated records, and tried to silence a woman who dared to stand up to them. This is an abuse of power, a betrayal of the community's trust." Richard Carmichael shifted uneasily in his seat. For once, his polished composure cracked, revealing the strain beneath. As Marcus spoke, Eleanor caught the gaze of Judge Collins in the audience. His expression was grave but encouraging, a silent anchor in the storm. Then came the bombshell. Just as Marcus finished, the courtroom doors burst open. A young woman hurried in, breathless, clutching a folder. "Your Honor," she said urgently, "I have new evidence regarding the HOA's dealings." The judge allowed her to approach. She revealed documents, emails, contracts, and photos that confirmed the secret sale of Meadowbrook's historic properties to a major developer. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The woman introduced herself as an insider, a former HOA employee who had left after witnessing the corruption. This sale was hidden from the community, she testified. The board planned to profit while destroying the neighborhood's character. The courtroom erupted into chaos. The judge called for order, but the damage was done. Richard's face paled as the weight of the revelation crushed his defenses. Eleanor felt a surge of vindication mixed with dread. The fight was nearly won. But what would come next? Outside, reporters swarmed. Cameras flashed. The neighborhood that had once whispered rumors now shouted truths, yet danger lurked in the shadows. That night, Eleanor found her gate vandalized, its iron twisted, a crude warning carved into the wood. But instead of fear, Eleanor felt fierce determination. "This legacy is not just mine," she whispered. "It belongs to all of us." The courtroom was electric with tension as the judge reviewed the new evidence. The anonymous insider's revelations had turned the tide, exposing the HOA's darkest secret. Eleanor sat with Marcus and Judge Collins, feeling the culmination of months of battle ripple through the room. The judge cleared his throat, his voice calm but firm. Based on the evidence presented, this court finds the Meadowbrook HOA board guilty of fraud, coercion, and breach of fiduciary duty. Their attempts to silence Mrs. Harding and erase her family's legacy are hereby invalidated. A collective exhale swept through the courtroom. Eleanor's knees felt weak, but her spirit soared. The judge continued. Furthermore, the HOA's illegal agreement with the developer is null and void. Meadowbrook's historic district protections will be reinforced. The plaintiff's gate shall remain intact, and all fines against her are rescinded. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted in cheers. Eleanor felt hands on her shoulders, neighbors, once wary, now proud and supportive. The fight had united them in ways she never imagined. Richard Carmichael and several board members faced criminal investigations. The whispers of intimidation and vandalism became evidence in an ongoing police inquiry. But the story wasn't over. That evening, as Eleanor returned home, a familiar black SUV idled at the corner. Her heart tightened. But this time she didn't retreat. From the shadows stepped a young man, the same figure who had spied on her, who had sent the anonymous evidence. "I'm sorry for scaring you," he said quietly. "My name is Ben. I'm part of a grassroots group fighting the same fight from inside the HOA. We needed someone brave enough to stand up." Eleanor's eyes softened. Allies had come from the most unlikely places. Together, they walked to the gate, now freshly repaired and gleaming in the sunset. "This gate is more than iron and wood," Eleanor said softly. "It's a symbol of resilience, a testament to the stories that built this neighborhood." Ben nodded. "And thanks to you, those stories will live on." Months later, Eleanor's home became a landmark, a symbol of victory for communities fighting corporate greed and corruption. Meadowbrook held a celebration, neighbors gathering to honor their history, their unity, and their future. Eleanor looked around at the faces shining with hope and pride. The battle had been long and harrowing, but the legacy of 120 years was safe. And so was the spirit of Meadowbrook, a spirit that no HOA, no developer, and no darkness could ever extinguish.